When we hear the name Auschwitz, it conjures images of horror, death, and unimaginable suffering. But it didn't begin as the largest killing center of the Holocaust. Its evolution was a process, methodical, deliberate, and rooted in Nazi ideology. To understand how Auschwitz became a factory of death, we must return to its origins. In 1940, the Nazis established Auschwitz in the Polish town of Auschwitz. At first, it was not intended as an extermination camp, but as a detention center for political prisoners, intellectuals, and resistance fighters from occupied Poland. The site was chosen for strategic reasons. Its central location in occupied Europe and excellent rail connections made it ideal for future expansion. The first prisoners, mostly Polish political detainees, arrived in June 1940. They were housed in former Polish army barracks surrounded by barbed wire. At this stage, Auschwitz resembled other concentration camps in the growing Nazi network. Brutality was present from the start, but systematic killing had not yet begun. That would come later. Adolf Hitler and Heinrich Himmler envisioned a vast network of camps that could serve both the economic and racial goals of the Third Reich. Auschwitz, with its infrastructure and location, quickly drew attention. Himmler saw it as more than a prison. He saw it as a center for implementing the final solution, the plan to annihilate European Jewry. By 1941, the focus shifted dramatically. The German invasion of the Soviet Union brought millions of Jews under Nazi control, accelerating the genocidal agenda. Existing camps were inadequate for the scale of killing the regime envisioned. Auschwitz was about to change forever. In October 1941, construction began on a massive new facility, Auschwitz II, known as Birkenau. It was not designed as a mere prison. It was built for mass extermination. Its layout reflected cold, bureaucratic efficiency. Vast barbed wire enclosures, watchtowers, wooden barracks crammed with thousands of prisoners, and, most chilling of all, gas chambers and crematoria. The design aimed for industrial-scale killing. Instead of scattered executions or shootings, which were messy and inefficient, the Nazis sought a system where murder could be organized like an assembly line. Every part of Birkenau's design served this purpose. The railway tracks extended directly into the camp, allowing entire transports of men, women, and children to be unloaded within minutes. Selection ramps were positioned for quick sorting. Those deemed unfit for labor, often the elderly, sick, and children, were sent straight to their deaths. While Birkenau became the killing hub, the original Auschwitz camp evolved into an administrative center. Nearby, Auschwitz III, or Monowitz, was built to support the German war economy through forced labor, especially for the IG Farben chemical plant. The combination of extermination and exploitation made Auschwitz unique in the Nazi camp system. It was both a death camp and a source of slave labor. What made Auschwitz so deadly was not only its size, but its design philosophy. It was meant to function like a machine, a place where human lives could be processed, exploited, and destroyed with maximum efficiency. The Nazis applied modern engineering and logistical planning to mass murder. This was genocide turned into an industrial operation. In its early phase, however, the full killing infrastructure was not yet in place. The methods of extermination were still being tested and refined. Gas vans, shootings, and starvation were common, but the architects of Auschwitz were already planning something far more systematic. By the end of 1941, the blueprint was clear. Auschwitz would become the centerpiece of the final solution. Its design would allow the Nazis to kill on a scale the world had never seen before, and it was only the beginning. By the time Auschwitz II, known as Birkenau, began to rise from the frozen ground, the concept of systematic extermination had already taken root. The Nazis understood that killing on a massive scale required more than soldiers with rifles. Shooting squads had been used extensively on the Eastern Front, but they were slow, inefficient, and psychologically damaging to the perpetrators. For the final solution to succeed, killing had to be industrialized. It had to be detached, mechanical, and efficient. Auschwitz would become the ultimate experiment in turning murder into a production process. The earliest method the Nazis tested at Auschwitz involved small-scale gas chambers in the basement of Block 11, a building in the original camp. They experimented with Zyklon B, a pesticide used for disinfecting clothing. Its deadly potential soon became clear. Unlike carbon monoxide from gas vans, Zyklon B was easy to transport, easy to store, and lethal in a matter of minutes. These early trials convinced the SS that they had found their solution. It was only a matter of scaling up. The design of Birkenau reflected this grim purpose. Massive crematoria complexes were built, each containing gas chambers disguised as shower rooms. Victims were told they were going to bathe and be disinfected. Signs instructed them to hang their clothes neatly and remember their hook numbers. This deception was deliberate. It kept order and prevented panic. Once the doors were sealed, Zyklon B pellets were poured through openings in the roof or side vents. Within 15 to 20 minutes, silence fell. The chambers were then ventilated, and Sonderkommando prisoners, forced to assist in this macabre process, removed the bodies. The bodies were not buried. They were burned in industrial crematoria designed to run day and night. At peak capacity, the 4 main crematoria at Birkenau could incinerate thousands of corpses in a single day. Even this was not enough during the height of the deportations. When the crematoria could not keep up, bodies were burned in open-air pits, sending plumes of black smoke into the sky. Witnesses described the stench of burning flesh carrying for miles, a constant reminder of what Auschwitz had become. Every detail was engineered for speed and efficiency. The railway spur was extended directly into the heart of Birkenau, so transports could be unloaded within sight of the gas chambers. There were no delays. The selection process took minutes. SS doctors stood on the ramp, casually pointing left or right, life or death determined with a flick of the hand. Those sent left went straight to the chambers. Those sent right were registered, tattooed, and sent to the barracks for forced labor. But even labor was only a temporary reprieve. Starvation, disease, and exhaustion claimed most within months. The design also minimized the visibility of killing to the outside world. Barbed wire fences, electrified and deadly, enclosed the entire complex. Guard towers dotted the perimeter, manned with machine guns. Escape was virtually impossible, and few tried. Inside this system, human life had no value beyond what could be extracted from it: gold teeth, hair, personal belongings. Even the ashes from the crematoria were dumped into rivers or used as fertilizer. Every aspect of death was monetized or repurposed. By 1943, Auschwitz had become the largest killing center in history. Entire families were transported from across Europe, Hungary, France, the Netherlands, Greece, on trains that ran like clockwork. At its peak, during the summer of 1944, when Hungarian Jews were deported, more than 400,000 people were murdered in less than 8 weeks. The scale was staggering, and yet the killing process never faltered. It ran with the precision of a factory assembly line, overseen by men who saw themselves not as murderers, but as administrators of a necessary task. The engineering behind Auschwitz was not just physical, it was psychological. The Nazis designed a system where individual responsibility was diffused. No single person felt the full weight of the crime. Guards on the ramp, workers in the crematoria, clerks in the offices, all were cogs in a machine that had turned genocide into routine. This was the true horror of Auschwitz, not just that millions died, but that their deaths were made ordinary by a system designed for maximum efficiency. And yet, despite this chilling efficiency, Auschwitz was not only a place of death, it was also a place of suffering, humiliation, and despair that stretched far beyond the gas chambers. For those not killed immediately, survival meant enduring conditions that defied imagination. The next stage of Auschwitz's transformation was not just about killing faster, but about breaking the human spirit completely. Those who were spared immediate death at Auschwitz faced a different kind of sentence, one of slow destruction. The camp was not only a killing center, but also a place of systematic dehumanization. Every part of daily life was engineered to strip away dignity and identity, reducing people to numbers, in a system designed to erase their humanity before it took their lives. Upon arrival, prisoners who survived the initial selection were forced through a brutal intake process. Their names ceased to matter. Each person received a number tattooed into the skin of their forearm, which became their only identity. Heads were shaved, possessions confiscated, clothing replaced with thin, striped uniforms that offered no warmth against the bitter Polish winters. Even shoes were often wooden clogs or mismatched scraps that tore at the feet. The humiliation was deliberate. By removing individuality, the Nazis sought to break the spirit of those they intended to work to death. Life inside the camp followed a rigid and merciless routine. Each day began before dawn with the sound of whistles and shouted commands. Prisoners stumbled from their overcrowded barracks for roll call, often standing for hours in snow or rain while guards counted and recounted them. If someone was missing, the entire block could be punished, sometimes forced to stand until bodies collapsed in the mud. Dead prisoners were propped upright to keep the numbers correct. For the living, the day had only just begun. Work was relentless and exhausting. Prisoners were sent to labor in quarries, construction sites, or factories tied to the German war machine. At Auschwitz III, also known as Monowitz, thousands toiled for the IG Farben chemical company under conditions so harsh that life expectancy was measured in weeks. The phrase, extermination through labor, was no figure of speech. Starvation diets, brutal beatings, and 12-hour shifts ensured that most would die before long. Those who faltered were beaten or shot on the spot. Hunger consumed everything. Rations consisted of a piece of black bread in the morning, watery soup at midday, and perhaps a small slice of sausage or margarine at night. These meager portions added up to fewer than 1,000 calories a day, far too little for men and women forced into heavy labor. Starvation hollowed out the body, turning prisoners into skeletons draped in skin. Some fought over crumbs. Others risked their lives to steal a potato peel from a garbage heap. Disease spread unchecked through the barracks: typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. Medical care was almost non existent. A prisoner too weak to work was as good as dead. But survival was not just a physical struggle, it was a psychological one. The camp system was designed to breed despair. Beatings and executions were common, sometimes carried out for no reason other than to instill terror. Punishments were public, and the gallows stood as a constant warning. Yet even in this world of calculated cruelty, there were those who clung to fragments of humanity, sharing a crust of bread, whispering a prayer, holding on to hope in the face of certain death. For some, hope was sustained by resistance, though resistance in Auschwitz was almost impossible. A few managed to organize secret networks, smuggling information to the outside world or plotting escapes. These acts were rare and carried the ultimate risk. Discovery meant torture and execution, not only for the individual, but often for everyone in their block. Still, the very existence of resistance was a testament to the human spirit's refusal to be extinguished, even in a place built to annihilate it. Auschwitz was more than barbed wire and chimneys. It was a meticulously constructed system that combined physical annihilation with moral and emotional degradation. For those inside, time seemed endless, marked only by hunger, exhaustion, and fear. Each day was a battle to endure, with the shadow of the crematoria always looming in the distance. Even for those who survived the work and the selections, the nightmare was far from over. In the final phase of the war, as the Allies advanced and the Nazi regime began to crumble, Auschwitz would enter its most chaotic and deadly chapter, a desperate attempt to erase the evidence of its crimes and the lives it had consumed. By late 1944, the tide of war had turned against Nazi Germany. The Red Army was advancing from the east, pushing deep into Poland, while Allied forces pressed in from the west. Inside Auschwitz, the SS realized the end was near. But rather than abandon their crimes to the judgment of history, the Nazis chose a different path. They tried to erase the evidence. What followed was a final chapter of horror, the death marches. Orders came from Berlin to dismantle the killing machine. Documents were burned, crematoria destroyed with explosives, and as much evidence as possible was obliterated. But the most chilling part of this effort was the evacuation of prisoners. The SS forced tens of thousands of men, women, and children out of Auschwitz and its subcamps and drove them westward on foot. These were the death marches, and they were as merciless as anything that had come before. In January 1945, the first columns began moving out into the brutal winter cold. Snow covered the ground, and temperatures dropped far below freezing. Prisoners were given almost nothing: no proper clothing, no food, no shelter. They were already emaciated, weakened by starvation and disease, yet they were expected to march for miles each day. Those who stumbled or fell behind were shot without hesitation, their bodies left by the roadside. The sound of gunfire became as constant as the crunch of boots on ice. The marches stretched on for days, even weeks. Some prisoners covered distances of over 50 kilometers, others more than 500. Entire roads were lined with corpses, frozen where they fell. Those who survived described drinking melted snow to stay alive, scavenging anything edible from ditches, and sleeping in open fields or barns if they were lucky enough to stop. At night, the temperature plunged even lower, and many never woke up again. The stench of death and the moans of the dying filled the cold air, a grim soundtrack to the collapse of the Reich. These marches were not chaotic, they were deliberate. The SS wanted to prevent prisoners from falling into Allied hands alive, fearing what their testimony would reveal. At the same time, they still clung to the illusion of control, moving survivors deeper into Germany to continue forced labor. But in truth, the marches were acts of extermination by other means, a continuation of the genocide through exhaustion, exposure, and starvation. Those who reached their destinations often found little reprieve. Camps in Germany, such as Dachau and Buchenwald, were already overcrowded and disease-ridden. New arrivals brought fresh waves of typhus and dysentery, creating conditions as deadly as the ones they had fled. For many, the end of the march was simply another place to die. Meanwhile, inside Auschwitz itself, chaos reigned. As the SS destroyed records and burned archives, they also killed thousands who were too weak to move. Gas chambers continued to operate in the final weeks, even as Soviet artillery grew louder in the distance. When the evacuation was complete, only a fraction of the original population remained. Those left behind were the sickest, the weakest, those deemed not worth the effort of moving. The scale of the disaster is almost beyond comprehension. Of the more than 1 million people murdered at Auschwitz, most were dead before the war's final months. But for those who lived long enough to see the retreat, survival was no guarantee. The marches claimed tens of thousands more lives, lives lost in ditches, on roadsides, in frozen forests, their stories carried away by the wind. For the few who endured this ordeal, liberation was still weeks away. Yet even as they trudged through the snow, their bodies broken and their minds numbed by suffering, a flicker of hope remained. The sense that somewhere beyond the horizon, the guns of their tormentors were falling silent, and the world they once knew might still exist. That fragile hope was all they had left, and for some, it was enough to keep them moving forward, step after agonizing step, into an uncertain future. When the Red Army finally reached Auschwitz on January 27th, 1945, they were met not by the machinery of death at full capacity, but by the silence of a place where horror had already passed. The SS had fled days earlier, leaving behind only what they could not destroy: thousands of prisoners too weak to walk, the ashes of countless others, and the remnants of a system built for mass murder. The soldiers who entered the camp that day were hardened by years of war, yet nothing could prepare them for what they saw. Emaciated figures lay motionless on wooden bunks, their bodies so thin they seemed almost transparent. The stench of disease and decay filled the air. Outside, piles of corpses lay frozen in the snow, abandoned by their killers. Scattered across the camp were shoes, glasses, and mountains of human hair, mute testimony to the scale of the slaughter. Liberation was not an eruption of joy. For many prisoners, it was difficult even to understand what freedom meant after years of degradation and terror. Some stared blankly at their liberators, too weak to move. Others wept quietly, clutching at the soldiers' hands. The first task was survival, and even that was uncertain. Typhus and dysentery raged through the camp, claiming thousands more lives in the days and weeks after liberation. Doctors and nurses worked desperately to save as many as they could, but for many, help had come too late. The Allies who liberated Auschwitz and other camps across Europe were determined that the world should know what they had found. Photographs were taken, films recorded, reports written. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, upon visiting a liberated camp in Germany, insisted that everything be documented, fearing that someday someone would deny the truth. His fear was well-founded. Even as the war ended, whispers of denial began to surface, a cruel insult to the memory of the dead. For the survivors, freedom marked the beginning of another struggle, the struggle to live again. They emerged from Auschwitz with nothing, families gone, homes destroyed, identities erased. Many had no idea where to go. Displaced persons camps were set up across Europe, offering temporary shelter, but the scars of the past could not be so easily erased. Some emigrated to new lands, America, Israel, Australia, seeking to build lives from the ruins of their old ones. Others returned to their hometowns, only to find them empty or hostile. The psychological wounds ran deep. Many survivors carried the burden of what became known as survivor's guilt, haunted by the question of why they had lived when so many others had perished. Nightmares followed them into the peace that others celebrated. For some, the war never truly ended. The world, too, faced the challenge of reckoning with Auschwitz. In 1945 and 1946, the Nuremberg trials sought to bring Nazi leaders to justice, charging them with crimes against humanity. Evidence from Auschwitz was central to the proceedings. Blueprints of gas chambers, orders for Zyklon B, testimonies from SS officers and survivors alike. The trials established the principle that such crimes would never be forgotten, but they could never fully account for the enormity of the loss. Today, Auschwitz stands as a museum and a memorial, its barbed wire and barracks preserved as a warning to future generations. The words, "never again," echo through the ruins, yet their meaning depends on memory. To forget would be to let the crime triumph a second time. Over 1 million people were murdered at Auschwitz, most of them Jews, but also Poles, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, and others deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. Each number was a name, a life, a story. Each belonged to someone who laughed, dreamed, and hoped before a system designed for death erased them from the world. Liberation did not end the suffering, but it did end the machinery of annihilation. It shattered the illusion that such evil could remain hidden forever. And as the gates of Auschwitz opened to the world, the truth emerged in all its unbearable weight. This was not a tragedy of fate, but a crime of human design. It was built, engineered, and executed by men who believed they were creating order, when in fact, they were manufacturing death on a scale humanity had never seen before. Remembering Auschwitz is not a matter of history alone. It is a responsibility, a warning of what happens when hatred is allowed to harden into policy, when prejudice becomes law, and when human beings are reduced to numbers on a page. The ruins of Auschwitz still stand, silent but unyielding, a voice for those who can no longer speak. And in that silence, the world is reminded that such darkness is never inevitable, but it is always possible if we choose to forget.